Hello, we are live. Thank you for joining today for our tariff webinar.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We'll give it another 30 seconds for people to join, and then we'll get started here.
First off, I just want to thank everybody for joining, but also if we're going to take questions at probably 2 points throughout this webinar, and if you're on YouTube, there's a YouTube chat functionality, and if you're on LinkedIn, there is a comments or chat section usually below the video, or it's a little different if you're on mobile. So please use that with kind of specific questions you have coming up. And the signal is now looking good. I see positive signals on my end from LinkedIn. So we're going to pull up our presentation and kick it from the top.
Let's get started. So I'm Ambrose Conroy. I'm the founder and CEO of Seraph. Appreciate everyone joining today. We're doing these webinars. We've been talking about tariffs for quite a while now. We're fairly deeply involved. We're helping companies with war rooms. We're helping to move operations. We've already completed a crash move. We've got others in process. There's a lot of work going on right now with the companies that are most advanced. Others are beginning to realize that we have a need to move. Companies that are just being impacted by the tariffs or realizing that they're going to be impacted by the tariffs are losing money already without even knowing it, and starting to develop plans to figure out how can they do it. And we're now getting to the point where companies need to have a strategy and respond rather than react. And we'll talk a lot more about that throughout the webinar. If you haven't already, we do a lot of this through LinkedIn. So please follow me, follow Justin, follow Harrison. Justin, do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Hi, yeah, I'm Justin Fortier. I lead a lot of the research we do here at Seraph, focused on helping manufacturing executives understand different shifts, whether it's in past years, some of the big challenges were around labor or locations, where to set up factories, or different challenges impacting sectors. We really started with the automotive industry, but are branching out now and have a webinar for medical device leaders coming up in a month or so. So the Seraph LinkedIn page is one where we're constantly sharing our updates and our research. And I'm totally open. You can either email me at jfortier@seraph.com, or you can email the research team at research@seraph.com. When you have specific questions, we have lots of projects going on with manufacturers around the globe, a lot in North America, but around the globe too. And that's one way where we get information. We conduct surveys, but also we're always listening to whenever somebody has a particularly thorny challenge that they're working through.
Thanks, Justin. Harrison, do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Yeah, I'm Harrison Catlin. I'm a consultant at Seraph, and I'll be sharing later on in the presentation a case study on how the automotive sector tariffs are impacting OEMs.
Thanks, Harrison. Oh, let's jump into this now. So please follow Seraph, follow me, follow Justin, follow Harrison. We're all interested in hearing what you have to say, and we'll reach out. So President Trump had his Liberation Day. I'm calling it Global Tariff Day. So Global Tariff Day has happened, and we're seeing a lot that's going on. There's impact. I had some great conversations very early this morning with Ireland. I was on a couple of shows there and talking to the EU about what's going on with these Trump tariffs. There's a feeling of victimization that I'm getting out of the reporters in the EU right now, and we need to shift that focus because there's a lot that can be done and be proactive. President Trump is really looking at this differently than past American presidents have looked at it. And we have to accept that. And there's some things that we're going to have to just accept that are in his head right now. So one of the core tenets is that he doesn't believe that America is great. He thinks we've lost our way. And he's trying to focus on how do we make that great again. He's looking at the American middle class, and he's looking at the auto workers. He's looking at the union jobs that were high paying jobs. It's why he had an auto worker at his revelation for the Liberation Day speech in the Rose Garden yesterday. He wants to make sure that everyone understands he is trying to rebuild the American middle class, and he understands that there are critical skills that we need to develop. We need to get people to come back to working manufacturing jobs. And a side note here, something that's very, very interesting is that China, President Xi is also pushing kids coming out of secondary education to get into manufacturing. He wants college educated and people leaving secondary education to move into manufacturing jobs. People need to focus on making things. This shift to being in service businesses, as someone who runs a service business, I can say this, is getting pushback now from administrations around the world. We want things to be made, and we want things to be made locally. So what we're seeing is this push for reindustrialization. President Trump wants to create these jobs. He wants to reindustrialize America, and he wants to make sure that we have the infrastructure in place to move things forward. We're at a tariff rate that we haven't seen in quite a while. In the 1800s, the U.S. was funded quite a bit by tariffs, moving into the 1930s. And in the 1930s, we really saw some things moving around World War II. Between World War I and World War II, the U.S. deindustrialized, and FDR and Henry Ford spent a lot of time figuring out how to reindustrialize the United States. There are a lot of similar things we can see today with President Trump and Elon Musk, as well as many others who are influencing him right now. But there's a huge historical context here. And what Trump is trying to do is he wants to get the American middle class in place. So we're seeing the markets fall. President Trump is holding true to what he's doing. He's going to reindustrialize where we are, and he wants to make sure that factories come back to the United States and we're building things within the country. I think Europe will end up following a very similar process. So if you're joining us from Europe, Trump's message of if you want to sell it in the U.S., make it in the U.S. is ringing true. Tariffs are going to be here for a while as long as Congress doesn't step in and do something, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But we're seeing now some clarity and simplicity to these tariffs, so we can start to move forward and make decisions.
Yeah. And one interesting note just from that last slide too, listening in the last couple, originally when he was campaigning, he seemed to ignore any of the potential downsides of these actions, but he has acknowledged, although he immediately denies them usually afterward, about the negative repercussions. But he is signaling that he seems to be okay with the numbers, not the stock market performance and corporate profits not being as strong as they were the previous time. And he talks about seeing new factories being built. That seems to be one of his key messages and metrics that he's trying to do. And it seems like he's willing to bear some cost to get there. Back to you, Ambrose.
And his philosophy on trade here is very different than other administrations have had. He is willing to bear that cost, but he's also been very consistent here. So this is one of the things that I think a lot of people miss. He's talked about tariffs. He's talked about trade deficits for decades. He was concerned about it in the 1970s and 1980s, and it's built from there. The Japanese cars coming into the United States, different points, different inflection points in our trade history have really elicited a strong response from Trump and from Lutnick as well at different points. So he's got a team that is very focused on trade and wants to make sure that this is going to happen. We've talked about the border being one of his key points. He has really changed what's going on with illegal immigration and crossing the border. We read about that every day. That has implications for manufacturing companies. I think we'd all agree that we need a good, strong immigration policy with legal immigration so that we can get more workers into the country and make things better. And then Trump is focused very much on energy. He wants to have cheaper energy in the United States. And I think he understands right now that if we have cheaper energy in the country, our manufacturing costs are better. So he's driving that very hard. And he's looking at countries like Germany. I was in DC several weeks ago, and one of the things that I heard was they were shaking their head and trying to understand how Germany let their energy costs get so high, how they let the Green Party move away from nuclear power and increase the cost of energy to a point where it's almost impossible to manufacture competitively in Germany. So Trump 47 is very different than his last administration. They're organized, they're executing, they're moving with a speed that I have never seen in government. They're treating this very much like a corporate merger. They're cutting and they're seeing what the impact is afterwards, and they'll fix what's broken as they move. But they're really trying to get things done quickly and feeling like they're running out of time. So Trump's going to keep these tariffs. He said these tariffs are permanent. And we have to look at, will these last beyond Trump? And I think there's good indication that they will. So we have bipartisan stance here. Trump, in his last term, put tariffs in place on China. And the Biden administration maintained and expanded those tariffs. So there's broader support, there's bipartisan support for tariffs against China. And I think a lot of this goes back to China and then trying to rebalance trade deficits in general. Lutnick is all about balancing trade deficits in general. There's a gentleman named Peter Navarro who wrote a book called Death by China, who's very anti-China, who has the president's ear and spent some time in jail for him. So those are two key voices that have a lot to say. Bessett has a slightly different view. I think he'll be disappointed with the impact on the markets. But President Trump has accepted that risk. He acknowledges that recession is a risk, and they're going to work to avoid that. But he sees it as a trade-off for reindustrialization, and the clock is running right now. So we've got 2 years for Trump to get that done, and we have to have things in place by midterms. So we're going to talk a little bit about reciprocal tariffs, and at this point, I'll turn it over to Justin.
So highlighting from yesterday, we wanted to host this today because we knew that a lot of companies would be trying to break down what was announced. And I think one of the clearest things that stood out to us yesterday looking was the 10% duty on imports around the world. Really, the 10% minimum is something that will show. Harrison will explain the formula they use to calculate these, which was a little simpler than previously advertised in just a few slides. And then they're going to follow up with higher country-specific tariffs on April 9th next week. And we'll go through what those are. But big impacts like Ambrose was messaging earlier on China in particular, especially due to some of the stacking of other tariffs that already exist. And then as well as we've been publishing research on countries with the largest trade deficits because that's what they've been talking about for a long time. That's what they're focused on. And that aligned with the rates that are going to be charged here coming next week. And although this probably won't impact as many of the manufacturers on this call, but the de minimis exemptions are ending. So this is for people that are importing small parcels valued less than $800. That is going away, which is really going to change how a lot of the large companies like Shein or Temu were operating. And so they're starting with China, but they're saying as soon as the infrastructure is in place to collect more of those tariffs, they're going to roll that out to the whole world. Now, there were some notable carve-outs. I think one of the first questions we asked yesterday when he was announcing these was, does the 25% automotive tariffs stack on top of the, let's say, 34% reciprocal tariff in China or the 25% tariff in South Korea? And the answer is no. Automotive is carved out. The tariffs on steel and aluminum are also carved out. And they did set a value content threshold for if a content is at least 20% US content, it only applies to the non-US originating content. And they did publish a list of things, including copper, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, and a whole bunch of different imports in the mineral category that are excluded from reciprocal tariffs, as many of those are either critical inputs or inputs for a lot of other industries. And USMCA, so Canada and Mexico, they were both left out of these. And
but
so,
before we jump on from that, Justin, I just want to point out that pharmaceuticals are one area that the administration has said they may come back and look at. Those are protected right now by WTO, so they're being a little bit more cautious. But there is a significant imbalance, and there's a feeling, and this administration seems to do a lot by feeling that companies that are or were U.S. headquartered that have moved a lot of production and IP offshore are not paying their fair share of U.S. taxes. So we may very well see, and I expect to see pharmaceutical tariffs. Conversations that I had this morning with people in Ireland indicate that they're expecting it as well. Simon Harris, Michael Martin really have both come out and said they're concerned about it. So there's a lot of concern about tariffs on pharmaceuticals. Semiconductors, I think, are another thing we may see as TSMC makes a big investment in the U.S. So there's a lot going on right now, and even these things that are excluded, I think we can expect to see changes, and there is potential and even a probability that tariffs may come into play. Back to you, Justin.
So one notable exemption on this, and we were pulling this together fast. So there's a couple countries in Africa and Southeast Asia that actually do have tariffs, but Russia was exempted because of there's no trade with the U.S. right now due to sanctions or very minimal trade that have been going on for a few years now. So when we look at the overall impact, so that we just took the reciprocal tariff amount and multiplied that by the amount of imports that come in, you can see which countries are at the highest level. This is basically maps exactly to what the trade deficits are. So, which leads us into, actually we'll show it one slide from now. But before we get to that, so I already mentioned that there is some stacking that's happening, but due to the exclusions in the reciprocal tariff announcement, the USMCA, steel, and automotive tariffs are not going to layer on top of the reciprocal tariffs, but notably that China will layer on top, so that the rate is now at 54%, which is, when Ambrose was talking about the bipartisan consensus, I think that there's probably a lot of disagreement on what these tariffs are at presently between the parties, but the China is really where we're seeing the most bipartisan behavior over the last 8 years. And
the 10% tariff that we're seeing as a baseline, I think what that's messaging is that the U.S. is going to have a tariff in place. It's now going to be built in part of the structure to how the government is funded and financed. So we have to account for that, and we need to be planning. We need to have a strategy to take that into account, and we need to understand that the era of chasing low-cost countries for manufacturing and doing labor arbitrage is likely over, unless you have components or products that have a very significant labor component. There will be tariffs used now as levers to equalize trade. Lutnick has talked quite a bit about this, and there will be a lot of pressure building on China throughout the Trump administration. Navarro is very actively whispering in Trump's ear, and we're seeing the impact of that in the fact that all of the tariffs on China seem to be stacking, and that the pressure is increasing on China monthly.
And there's one other big tariff piece that was announced last week that we published an analysis on Venezuelan oil, just due to political disagreements. I think with Venezuela, the Trump administration is trying to use tariffs, or in this case, the threat of tariffs. They have to be activated by the Secretary of State on buyers of Venezuelan oil, which mostly includes China. They're the main one. They buy more than 60%, or they're the end buyer of that. So that hasn't been activated, but that's another piece of executive order that's out there that could be
Justin,
activated, but it's not at this time.
An interesting thing there is that Spain is part of it. So Spain is European Union. So a tariff on Spain would be basically a tariff on the European Union potentially. So
that was
we have to be
just for countries that were buyers, though. But yeah.
But we have to take this to the natural point. So that's potential there. So we would expect the European Union to be putting pressure on Spain to stop buying the Venezuelan oil, so that the European Union doesn't get this extra special 25% tariff should the government decide to put that in place. Lots of things shifting here, and there's still uncertainty. But what we have clarity on right now is hard tariffs, and where we see risk right now is that they're going to go up, not come down, and we don't believe these are going to go away anytime soon. So action is important. Having a plan and having a strategy is critical right now.
And I think, Harrison, maybe you could just talk briefly about the tariff calculation formula that they ended up using.
Yeah, I can jump in. So obviously, I think most people have seen those charts or whiteboard or whatever was held up at the talk yesterday, and it mentioned reciprocal tariffs from other countries that we're responding to. And really, what it turned out to be was they appeared to take the trade deficit that the U.S. has with any given country, divide it by the amount of imports we received last year, and then divide it by two, and that's how you got your the tariff numbers that they are ending up implementing. And funny enough, so they used US Census Bureau data, and with that, you get a perfect correlation 1 to 1. We used UN Comtrade data, and Afghanistan stands out as one that, with our data that we pulled, they should have had a higher tariff applied, but they received only 10%. So fortunate for them.
Yeah, and the administration, the way they messaged this tariff, they said for reciprocal tariffs, we're going to think about not just the tariff level, but basically everything that could be related to industrial policy, like currency manipulation, non-tariff barriers, so different regulations that make it difficult to sell products. And
but it was simplified, Justin, right? I mean, this is a very simple. This is simple high school math, where you add. We're dividing, and then we're adding, subtracting, dividing. We're not doing anything very complicated here. We're trying to figure out what the difference is in the trade deficit, and finding percentages, and then having it, which makes it, as you were saying, and as it says here, very difficult for countries to fix things. If this really is trade deficit driven, and we need to cure the trade deficit, it's not going to be as simple as dropping trade barriers. It's not going to be as simple as doing something else. It's really about fixing the trade imbalance. And there are countries in this world, countries like Vietnam, which I think is getting a brunt of a lot of these tariffs, is simply because they're not only shipping a tremendous amount to the United States, but there has been significant state-owned entity investment from China into companies in Vietnam that are then shipping out of Vietnam into the United States. So there are these loops that are going on, but they tend to tie back to China. And that seems to be a major focus here for the high tariff numbers. The others, it's really about this trade imbalance, and how do we look at that, and how do we see things move? So there wasn't a huge sophistication. There wasn't this deep analysis. I think the administration put some effort initially into doing it, and they found it was incredibly hard to calculate all these things, to come up with the right number, and they found a much simpler way. And we're using one data source here. Harrison, you talked about the other data source that was that the administration actually looked at, which put Afghanistan on the line. But when we look at this, it's very interesting to just see how simply they move forward with developing this model and working to get something in place. So lots here. I don't think the tariffs are going to come down very quickly. Trump has said these are permanent. So we need to start to figure out, what can we do? And there's a lot that we can think about doing to respond. We need to have a structured tariff mitigation program. And we've talked about this a lot with several people on this call. For others on this call, if you don't have a program right now, please reach out. We're very happy to have a conversation. We've got a planning phase here, and it's generally about 30 days you spend to get your models in place, to look at what's going on, to have sensitivities for different tariff levels, to make sure that we're understanding what we're doing and what we can do to make things work. And there are multiple paths to take to get that done. But you need to have a dedicated team. You need to do things like having a war room, and we'll go into these specific things. There is a lot of planning that best companies have done already. And we've got some clients who are already taking action. They're already doing crash moves. They're already pulling things forward. So we want to make sure that there are 6 key things that we think everyone here that's impacted by tariffs should be doing. So establish your supply chain, trade, and tariff war room. You need a dedicated and empowered team. Most companies don't have enough people with the skills. And if you're just going to the market to find them, you're not going to. And you want to look at fixed versus variable cost right now because tariffs are going to have a major financial impact. This is a great time to use outside experts to get things done. It's going to be consultants and it's going to be lawyers. So these are not inexpensive experts, but you're going to need them. You need to develop a comprehensive commodity and supplier model. So we want to look at where your supply chain is, where you're buying, what's going on. You're going to need to reboot your commercial strategy, and we'll talk much more about that. But how you're going to get money from your customers, how you're going to change your pricing in the market, and how you're dealing with your suppliers is going to be absolutely critical. What we've been doing, what we've all been trained to do over the last few decades, no longer works. So we need to take a very different approach. We need to fortify our balance sheets, and we need to protect our cash flow. And there are some things we can do to protect the cash flow right now. And there are things we can look at on the balance sheet. We want to reassess product lines. There's going to be SKU rationalization. There'll be products that we had that were marginal in terms of profit that we may need to stop looking at building, making at this point in time, to discontinue. We need to look at also best shoring our footprint in our supply chain. So there's a lot here that we can take a look at. And we'll jump into this a little bit more now. Key thing for everyone on here is we really want to encourage you, if you haven't already, dedicate a team. You need a cross-functional team. You need a supply chain war room. We need to look at trade and tariffs. We need to look at all the restrictions that could come into place. What we're seeing right now, we're seeing tariffs being put in place, but we expect that if people retaliate, we're going to start to see trade restrictions. We're going to start to see other levers being pulled, and it will complicate things in a very rapid way for a lot of supply chains. There's a company called Skydio that does drones. They had batteries cut off from China, and that had a big impact. There were some great news articles about that. This could happen more broadly. There's a lot of pressure that's being put on countries, and if we see supply cut off, it will be a real challenge. We want to make sure that when you have this cross-functional team in the war room, and you're going to need outside help, you're going to need legal, and you're going to need more horsepower than you can get with skills that you likely don't have. Very few people have a large tariff department. Very few people have a large department outside of purchasing and supply chain that understand how to manage complex commercial issues and provide the right data to your commercial team as they go forward. They have to be empowered. You have to have a steering committee. You have to have executive involvement. You want to monitor and track the intelligence. You need to have sources to do that. You need to have paths, and you need to advocate and have very solid contingency planning. We want to make sure that we're ready with a strategy so that we can respond to the changes that we're seeing. We don't want to be reacting. And we're seeing companies now that didn't have a strategy in place feeling like they have to react. You have to step back. You may need to do some tactical things today, but if you're not developing that strategy and that model so that you can understand what the impact is of your actions, you're going to get into trouble. We want to look at our comprehensive commodity model. We want to know where we're buying things from. We want to align each of the products that we have to the HTS, that harmonized tariff schedule. Very few people here will have ever looked at a harmonized tariff schedule. It's just not something that in the United States we've had to deal with very much, unless you're importing things from China or other places where there's more complexity. But a lot of companies that have used NAFTA very effectively and done pass-throughs through NAFTA were able to work around a lot of the complexity here. We had customs brokers that moved things through, but most things moved without tariffs. We're going to need to do things very, very differently. We're going to need to have a model that we can adjust. We're going to need to challenge all of our sacred beliefs, everything that we've done, everything that we built in to this point in time. We're going to need to look at suppliers that we've got in high tariff countries right now, find alternatives. We want to make sure we know who owns the suppliers that we're working with. Are they Chinese owned? Are they Chinese components? Is there Chinese origin in any of the tier N parts in there? We're thinking there's still a probability that anything that has anything touching China, any Chinese component or part, could get a special tariff treatment if there are retaliatory tariffs from China. We want to make sure that we know what supplier volumes are and commitments can be. You may have dual sourcing, tri-sourcing, you may have single sourcing. Where you have sourcing with more than one supplier, make sure that you know which supplier can produce more. If you've got suppliers in different tariff areas, take advantage of that. Use your models. Make sure that you're adjusting and mitigating your risk and your financial impact very actively. There are tools that we can help you. There are things you can do here. You may already have something. We're happy to have conversations around that, but you need to have a detailed model ready right now so that you can make some strategic decisions, you can understand the impact, and you can move forward. Without that, you're kind of flying blind right now. Commercial strategy is another thing that I think is very challenging right now. I've had a lot of conversations with commercial teams in the automotive industry, and I'm having a lot of conversations with executives outside of the automotive industry in other industries. We've talked to people in building products. We've talked to people in the medical device sector, in the pharmaceutical industry, in high tech, in direct to consumer and in business to business areas. They're looking at raising pricing right now. They're trying to figure out what they can do, what levers they can pull. They're figuring out what pricing increases are going to be pushed on them from suppliers. There's a lot of negotiation going on right now. There's a lot of reactions going on right now, and it's not clear what's going on in broad terms outside of the United States. People are very concerned and confused, and they're fearful right now. So you have to understand that your suppliers are going to be fearful. They're going to see these huge tariff increases as risk to them. China, when this happened last time with Trump, a lot of orders were canceled. We're seeing prepayment terms from a lot of Chinese suppliers for direct to consumer or even smaller businesses that are buying goods from China right now. You have to prepay or at least put down a significant deposit in order to get the product to move through. We're encouraging people to really dig into this quickly, carefully, and methodically so that you understand what the options are. You want to develop deep contract knowledge. So if you have suppliers who are on contract with you, who are developing, and you're sending them releases, you're calling off on that contract on a regular basis, you want to make sure you know what the terms are, how you can adjust, and how you can be prepared for these changes. We don't want to have suppliers coming to us every month asking for price increases, pushing different tariff levels through, pushing other costs through. One of the key things that we're finding out right now is that there's a lot more than just the pure tariff cost that suppliers are asking for. And even some of the manufacturers that we're working with are asking for from their industrial OEM customers. You've got broker fees that are getting tagged onto this. You've got to be hiring a significant number of people, setting up these war rooms, bringing in other variable cost, working with legal experts and lawyers to make sure that you understand what you can and can't do, and pushing things. There's advice coming from some customers right now that just change your transfer pricing, do different things. We want to make that very clear right here that you can't just change your transfer pricing. You need to be very, very careful with what you're doing. You need to make sure that transfer pricing is accurate. If you've been using one transfer price, you can't just go and change it. Talk to your tax advisors, talk to your law firm, make sure you have good legal opinions if you're going to make any changes to transfer pricing now that tariffs are in place. That's a clear sign to get into trouble. President Trump has talked about consequences if people play games with the tariffs, and you don't want to be caught on the wrong side of that. And the key thing here for me, the last thing I want to talk about in terms of commercial strategies, what we've done as a standard practice just doesn't work anymore. We've got an inflationary environment. We've got tariffs coming in play. We've got a lot of extra cost burden, and we're going to have to be going back to our customers, and we're going to have to be going to our suppliers, and we're going to be trying to pull pricing levers. If you're D2C online, it's fairly simple. You can monitor the pricing. You can have much more dynamic pricing. You can raise pricing as you want. If you're on longer term contracts, there's some negotiation that has to happen. A lot of the companies that we have on here in the medical device sector, in the industrial sector, in the automotive sector, are focused on how do they supply goods to an end OEM customer, or how does that end OEM customer sell the product onto the market. You need to understand where you can change prices, how you manage your suppliers. You need to set up clear policies and practices, and you need to have levers and tools for your suppliers to come through to you so that they can get price relief. But you want to make sure you control that. And without controls, it's going to get absolutely chaotic. And we're seeing suppliers right now who are demanding payment of tariffs up front, payment of goods up front. They can't carry the burden for 60, 90, 120 days. They need that money quickly. They just can't take that financial pain. They don't have the margins to do it. So we need to have structures in place to manage that. And if you don't have a team that's looking at this, that's digging into this very, very deeply, you want to make sure you get it in place. For those joining from the automotive industry, you likely don't have enough people on the commercial side to do this. You're going to need to be making very strong cases, very data-driven cases with all of the costs defined and working to push that to your customer. Tariffs are designed to be shared. It's not something that you're going to be able to take on, and we're going to see a lot of those pushed up to the customer that's buying your product and then pushed on to the end customer. The idea that these tariffs won't be passed on and won't impact the cost of goods, from my perspective, is a fallacy. We're going to see that passed on. We're going to need to see that passed on in order for the economy to continue to grow. And we'll see wage inflation. We'll see other things happen alongside this, but it's going to be a significant pressure. This is upward pricing pressure that we're going to see. So the whole idea that contracts can be written for a low inflationary environment and not take tariffs into account is over. We're going to need to be ready to have those price negotiations and discussions on an ongoing basis. But without a structure, you're going to be having these constantly. So we want to have a structure. We want to make sure that we're communicating clearly. We want to make sure we have the data that we need to convince our customers and to negotiate with our suppliers. There's a lot of work to be done here. There's probably more work to be done here than you did when you initially sourced your suppliers or when you got the contract. So you need to get that done, and you need to do it very, very quickly, because the window to get will close with the OEMs that you're selling to. Consumers will initially accept price increases, much like they did with COVID, but that there'll be reluctance and pushback afterwards, and suppliers will continue to come to you. So if you don't have a structure in place so that they can talk to you, you're going to be having pain for a long time, and you may experience some significant supply chain disruptions. We're then looking more broadly at balance sheets and protecting cash flow. So protecting cash flow, I think, is a key thing here, and we can look at some different things. So using bonded transportation and bonded warehouses to delay the payment of tariffs is something that we're encouraging all of our clients to do. Happy to talk to anyone here that is not doing this right now about how you might be able to do this. This is a simple tool you can use and a simple strategy. Throw that out there for everyone. It's sort of a key thing. Hopefully it's one of the things you take away from this, in addition to making sure that you have a supply chain, trade, and tariff war room set up, because that's absolutely critical. If you're large enough and you can, getting a free trade zone set up would be very beneficial. So larger manufacturers, we would encourage you to look at that. If you're exporting outside of the US, this will prevent you from having to pay a tariff bringing goods into the US and then possibly getting tariffed by someone else as you export it. There are some things that can be done there. It's a longer process. It's not so simple, and there is an administrative burden and cost to maintaining that. We want to look across your value stream. We want to do our typical operational excellence things. Most companies have done a tremendous amount of operational excellence work, taking cost out over the course of COVID, and then as things eased after COVID, as supply chains returned to a more normal state, we saw companies get fat again. We want to go back to that. We want to look at what we can do. Converting fixed to variable cost is something I'm encouraging everyone to take a look at. Don't bring on fixed cost. Let's focus on variable cost. If you can outsource, if you can do different things, if you can shift to get a higher variable cost within your operation, most companies will do better. It's something that will support the flexibility for the challenges that we're going to see around the tariffs and the structures. And then we want to make sure that organizational structures are optimized. Let's think about how things are going to happen, have an organizational strategy. Let's make sure it aligns to the new world order that we're seeing. Globalization is ending, mercantilism is rising. So you're going to need more functions within each region to deal with region-specific complexity. This is part of the cost that you're going to have to pass on to your customer, is the fact that you're going to need to build a different team in the US than you possibly have in Europe, than you possibly have in Mexico. Having a center of excellence for things won't necessarily work for your corporate services. But we want to make sure that as you're looking at these things, as you're looking at cutting, you don't want to cut muscle. You want to be able to grow a team, and you're going to need to be hiring younger people into your organization. We need to attract the youth into manufacturing right now. We need engineers, we need skilled trades, and we want to develop those people. Human resources departments for a long time have very much focused on risk avoidance and cost management. We need to shift back to human capital management and human capital development. And I think that's a key thing that we want to look at here. We also are encouraging everyone to look at SKU optimization and rationalization. Now is the time, using your war room, to go very deeply, look at all your products, look at your margins, look at your costs, look at what the supply base costs are going to do to them. And for products that you can't increase the price, where there's competition in the market, where you have a local supplier, or where you have someone that's got more local content, it may be time to mothball that product, to discontinue it. We want to look at value engineering. We want to look at stripping costs out. We want to look at figuring out how can we realign there. That's not something Seraph does, but we have some friends at different firms that can help with that. We're happy to make referrals and get people connected. There's a lot of work to do now to make sure that we've done our SKU optimization and we're not wrapping parts in $100 bills. It's just too costly right now, and it's very easy for that to happen. A lot of us will be, as we're selling products, losing money without even realizing we're losing money until it's too late. So we need to be protecting for what we're doing. We need to understand what the cost of every product is, and we need to make sure that on our product lines, we're doing the optimization that we need to do. Best shoring and making sure that we have our footprint and our supply chain in the right place is absolutely critical. The best way I know to take hard costs out of an operation is to consolidate roofs, or make sure that we're operating close to capacity within the plants that we have. So if we have extra capacity within plants in the United States, and there are a lot of companies that have mothballed plants, that have factories that are operating at 50, 60, 70% of capacity. We want to see shifting of product up to those plants. And there are ways we can do things very, very quickly. I'm going to say something here that a lot of our automotive clients won't like, but for automotive suppliers, it's a point in time where you can ask for forgiveness. Everything's negotiable right now. No one wants to pay these tariffs. You can go to your OEM customers and you can help them understand the cost savings that's potential, and you can share the risk with them on crash moves. There's a lot that can be done that doesn't go according to the normal way things would be done. We've just completed a move, and normally a move for non-safety critical things would take 12, 18, 24 months, depending on how long it takes to either secure CapEx, train people, or build banks, and then transfer knowledge. You can do those things in 3 months or less. We can look at doing things in a very aggressive way with a little bit more risk associated. We want to make sure that everyone understands and accepts that risk as we're doing it, but a lot of that risk is offset by tariff savings. So people are more willing to do it. If you're in other sectors, your margins may be better, but you may still have operations within the United States. Since these tariffs are not going away, the emergency powers that the president is using right now to put these tariffs in place allow him to hold them in place. Congress abdicated their ability to revoke his power for this term. The House did. So we're going to have these through at least this term. And there is a push with his big, beautiful bill to get these tariffs put into funding for the US government. So we expect them to stay. So let's look at what we can do right now to bring our supply chains into the country that we're selling product from, and let's look at fixing our footprint. Let's look at relocating our manufacturing. If you're outside the United States, bring it into the United States. Lots of discussions that we're having around, we don't have enough labor, we're concerned about automation. There are always concerns and there are always challenges. Our jobs as leaders are to find ways to work around those challenges and to allow our businesses to continue to survive and even thrive. And those that move fastest, those that get into the country that they're selling in, will do the best. Whether you're moving into, and I use country broadly for the United States, or into the European Union if you're selling there. This is going to change the way we're doing things. I expect that as part of getting relief from some of the US tariffs, the European Union is going to need to not only ease their tariffs on the United States, but also start to put more tariffs on the Chinese, because this is really, from what I'm seeing, from what I'm reading, a push back against the Chinese manufacturing engine and the state-sponsored manufacturers in China who have been unfairly competing with a lot of the Western manufacturing base. So if we take that and if we accept that, you're going to want to be manufacturing in the United States for the United States. There'll be some relief on Canada and Mexico. For high labor content, you'll be able to use Mexico, and there will be things you'll want to do in Canada. In Europe, you can use Eastern Europe. There's things you can do, but we want to look at moving more away from Asia where there is possibility to do so. Africa, Northern Africa, will see more of the low cost country mix go there, and we'll see things shift much closer to the region with a much more focus of bringing back into the region. And I think that will help to enable things to move faster. It will make the Trump administration happier, and we'll see that first mover advantage start to take hold. So want to open the floor up for some questions right now. People may be ready to move forward. They may be ready to take action on these tariffs. We're not sure. Justin, do we have some questions coming in, or do we want to go into some case studies?
Let's go into case studies. I'm replying to some of that. Some of them are very smaller, specific ones. So continue to add the questions. I'm going to reply to some of them, but let's walk through this automotive industry, and I think we can just go full screen here as well.
Excellent. Harrison, do you want to take us through this?
Yeah, I can take us through. So what we try to do here
before we jump into it, Harrison, I just want to throw out, automotive is the first sector to be impacted very heavily by tariffs. So we want to use this as a case study. If you're not in the automotive industry, it's worth paying attention to this, because this is something that could impact you as well. But there's a lot of data on automotive. It's already impacted by the tariffs. So we wanted to take a look at this in a little bit of detail. And if you are in the automotive sector, if this is interesting to you, please reach out. We're happy to discuss this more with you. Thank you, Harrison.
All right.
I'll turn it over.
Yeah. So I'll go through the methodology pretty quickly and just get to the conclusions to save on time. But what we tried to do here was estimate the financial implications of the currently announced and really now implemented automotive tariffs on major OEMs. And the way we did this was we took year-to-date 2025 sales data, and then we brought in production and sourcing data from a few different locations, most notably the AALA, excuse me. And they they require most OEMs to report where they're producing their vehicles and where they're sourcing key components. The major OEM that's left off here is Stellantis, unfortunately, but we can kind of assume their costs are similar to other major OEMs. So what we can see is that across all the major OEMs, there's varying levels of exposure to the US, but for the most part, everyone has a pretty decent amount of their business coming from the US, which is no surprise. They're a large global market. And then of these sales, a pretty large chunk are imported, despite the fact that they're sold in the US. A lot of them are made in Mexico.
Oh, Harrison, if we can pause for 1 second. I think that the size of the U.S. market is one of the concerns that I got from the calls that I had this morning with Europe. Everyone's very upset, but it's the U.S. market, and President Trump sees this as a pay-to-play opportunity. He's going to charge people to sell into this market if you don't want to manufacture it here. So he's talked very heavily about that. This is automotive, but this applies to every other sector as well. The U.S. is a large market. U.S. consumers spend disproportional to population. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about that as we're going through here. And this is an issue. It's why it's an issue that we all have to deal with.
Yeah, for
Sorry,
sure.
Harrison.
No worries. So of those vehicles sold in the US, we looked at how many are actually built here and how many are imported, and then what the actual dollar amount of potential tariff costs could be for each OEM. And it sums up to about 56 billion across the covered OEMs you see below. Most notably, Tesla, it has no impact here, although their vehicles are currently produced in the US. Then the other sector that we looked at, or the other category of tariffs, are those critical components that have been called out, which are engines, motors, transmissions, and batteries. Across this, you can see there's a pretty wide skew of how reliant OEMs are on foreign imports here. So foreign OEMs like BMW, Mazda, Mercedes, Nissan, Subaru, Volvo, they're importing a lot of these critical components that are going to get hit with the 25% tariff, and they'll have a lot more exposure than other OEMs. So in total, it's a lot smaller than the finished vehicle tariff exposure, but it's about 4 billion across all these OEMs. And then finally, we looked at, okay, what if the administration decided they wanted to expand these tariffs to all auto component imports? Because there was some kind of vague language in the executive order that mentioned they have the ability to expand this if they want. And this is where costs could rise. They could almost double. They could go up by 44 billion. And really, this is where no OEM is safe. Even we mentioned earlier that Tesla is pretty well covered in the current situation, but things could get pretty bad for them, as all the other OEMs are in a similar boat. Summing this all together, we can look at by OEM what their current exposure is and what the range is if tariffs were expanded out to all components. And the cumulative range here is about 60 to 100 billion, which is very significant. You can see, to no surprise, the OEMs that have a lot of their business in the US, like Ford and GM, have the most dollar value exposure. But when we look on the next slide, in terms of margin exposure, which is probably a more important metric to look at, and right here we have EBIT margins, you can see reading from kind of the right to the left here, the gray dot represents any given OEM's EBIT margin in 2024. The gold dot in the middle represents in our base case scenario, which is the tariffs on finished vehicles plus those critical components, how far their EBIT margin would drop. So for someone like BMW at the top, you can see it goes from about 8% down to 6%, which is a 2.1 percentage point change. And then the darker gray dot, we didn't want to call it out specifically because it's not really a scenario that we're planning for right now. But in a worst case scenario where tariffs expanded to all auto components, that's how far margins can drop. And the takeaway here is that these hits just aren't sustainable. OEMs aren't going to accept this or absorb all this cost. So we expect that prices are going to rise and tariffs are going to be passed on to the consumer. And here we kind of modeled out, okay, if OEMs truly wanted to pass every single cost along, they determined we can't absorb any of this hit. This is how far prices would have to rise by OEM. On average, it's about a 16% weighted average MSRP increase, but it differs a lot by OEM. So you can see Ford and GM in previous slides, we looked at their dollar value impact is pretty high, but the amount they'd have to raise prices is pretty low compared to some of their competitors, specifically BMW, Mercedes, Volvo, some of these higher end models that are almost all imported. It would require pretty substantial price increases. And you can see sometimes it even goes above the 25% tariff number. That's because the tariff paid would scale as they continue to increase prices. So and the last slide, we kind of talked about the EBIT margin hits aren't sustainable. Here you can kind of see that these price increases would not be taken well by consumers either. So we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. And we can expect that certain models will have price increases, some won't, and volumes in general will come down. Here you can look at kind of the different breakdowns of model categories and where we see some insulated platforms, some that are exposed in pretty critical parts of OEM's sales splits. And then at the top left, you can look at some luxury imports that have massive exposure but aren't a critical part of an OEM's business model. And I won't take the time to walk through each vehicle that's included here, but when we send this out or it's already been published to an extent, you can take a look and always ask us questions if there's specific categories or OEMs that you're interested in. And finally, we took a look at one specific market just as an interesting data point to show that within a given product category, in this case, the entry-level ICE SUVs, the exposure is definitely not consistent across OEMs, and it's going to make it very hard for some to pass along costs when others are not exposed and have the ability to remain at their current price. So in this case, we looked at any entry-level ICE SUV, which is between $20,000 and $30,000 at the lowest MSRP out there, and how prices would have to increase to pass along costs. You can see for the most part, these are imported vehicles. The price increase needed is pretty massive, but there's a few vehicles here, notably the Toyota Corolla Cross, the Kia Sportage, and the Hyundai Tucson, where they can afford to stay at their current price. And that puts a lot of pressure on these other OEMs to kind of take the EBIT hit or take a market share hit. And obviously we could do this for any market or any breakdown that you are interested in, but we didn't want to take the time to go through every single split today. So just showed this as an example. And I think
and
that
this is
just
the
about
kind of
covers
thing that
it.
we'd be. This is the kind of thing that we do. If we're running the war room, we'll break this down. We really look at how things are going. We want to make sure that there's good data across the board, because this helps us to understand if you're serving these customers. There's an automotive company that we're working with. If you're serving these customers, we want to understand what their risk is, where we think they'll be able to pass costs along, because this helps us as we go through and have those commercial negotiations and discussions. In other industries, it's harder to get some of this data, but there are other derivative data sources that we can use to look at to develop a strategy and help build these models. So as you're going through, as you're looking at what you're doing, how you're addressing tariffs, we want to make sure that we're really ready to respond strategically. We know what our tactical actions are going to be, and we can move forward with different approaches as things change and adjust. We don't expect these tariffs to be, we expect them to be constantly changing. We know that they'll be permanent. We don't expect them to be consistent all the way through. As I said, they're going to be constantly changing, and we'll get to a settled point probably after the summer, but there's a lot of negotiation that's going to have to happen. Trump's a real estate developer at heart. There was a comment that was made that he wanted to go see during the campaign. He wanted to go see the biggest and best automotive plant in the area, and he was told he had to go to Mexico to go see it. And I don't know which plant the developer who built it was saying, but he really wants to see the biggest and the best built in the United States. He's very focused on that. He's very focused on infrastructure. He's very focused on creating middle-class jobs. And as he drives that focus, he's going to keep these tariffs in place. He's said they're permanent. We've seen the Biden administration continue the China tariffs. I think a lot of these, as they get written into the tax code and are used as funding sources for the US government, will be very hard to eliminate. So we're going to have to wait and see what happens in the big, beautiful bill, but we have to be prepared. And that requires us to have a war room, that requires us to have models, that requires us to have a strategy that we can follow, and the ability to change, pivot, and tactically execute. We don't want to be reacting. So with that, let's open it up to questions. If there are some, I'm getting some here that I'll reach out to people on later, but we appreciate everyone joining the webinar and are very excited to have conversations.
Yeah, I think we can take a couple. I'm just loading up here.
And I know we've run to about the time limit here. We'll take some questions, but if you do have other questions, please reach out to myself, Justin, or Harrison. We're happy to chat about what we're doing here. We'd love to talk about what you're doing. If you don't have anything set up right now, please reach out. We'll talk you through what's best case. We'll try to help give you a little bit of structure. If you need help, we're happy to engage and help you. But my goal here is to make sure that industry is set up and ready to run with this challenge. I think this is bigger than COVID. I think there's a lot that we have to do together, and it's time for us all to pull together, whether in the United States, if you're in Europe, if you're in Mexico, if you're in Asia. Let's find a way to work together to get through this. It's going to change the way we do business, but there's tremendous opportunity here to continue to win.
Yeah, it looks like we pretty much one of the main questions we were getting was just about where, if people are going to get a copy of this presentation. Some of the other ones are minor, but I'm gonna call up.
Please, yeah, I think sending an email to one of the three of us is the best way to get it. The webinar will be live, but if you want the thing, you can also go to the Seraph tariff tracker. But please feel free to reach out to myself, to Justin or Harrison, and we can continue the conversation and get you the presentation. The case study we're not generally sending out. I'm happy to have a conversation with you about it and go through. But we're very happy to send out the presentation.
All right. And one final note, just one question, because I saw a couple people on it. Let me see if I can get to this one. This slide looked like two people were chatting about this, but this was just to show that the predicted tariff down at the bottom is saying that using the formula of the trade deficit divided by imports divided by 2, basically. So taking the trade deficit, dividing by imports, and then taking the greater of either 10% or that number. That's what we are seeing here. So this was just a point that they did a very simple calculation for how these tariffs are rolling out, and they verbally said that they are now looking for countries to lower their tariffs. But given the simplicity of this calculation, we're not exactly sure how those will play out. But that was one question I saw a couple things on. So if you want to have further discussions, our emails are here. Thank you very much for joining today, and we'll follow up with some of the minor questions that were asked, usually about specific parts or specific things inside the LinkedIn chat. Thanks for joining us today, and stay subscribed, and you can follow there, and you'll get more of this. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks very much. We look forward to talking to all of you. Again, if you're looking to figure out how to deal with this, happy to share our framework, happy to have discussions. Please reach out. It's free to have an initial discussion. Let's just talk. We want to make sure that industry is prepared. Have a great